It is an interesting problem because, as Merlin is saying, it's not this ephemeral thing. The user is going to likely be supplying their assets over time. And then in that context, we're dealing with potentially more than one chain.
When you trade or when you use a lending protocol or like you say, like prediction market, there's one thing that is just an atomic action.
But like perp dexes are really like the only app chains that have really done well because of like the synthetic nature of the liquidity.
All right, so we're here. We've gathered the brain trust. We have Michael from Legend. We have Nick from Melee, Merlin from Morpho, Ludwig from Sorella, Charlie from Felix. We also have on the variant side me, Jack, and Alana. The topic of today is really just to unpack aggregation on chain. What prompted this is Alana and I were having a discussion internally, really trying to figure out like why is it that like the major thing that seems to be like highly aggregated on chain right now is simply just swap. Like what is it about swaps that specifically make them so suitable for it? Like it's not nearly as common, although many are working on different efforts in both the lending space and prediction markets, and of course in perps. So this is just like an open space to kind of just like discuss our theories. Like what do I want to get from this? I'd love to get like what are the principles of making something like super aggregable, if that's even a word? Like, what are the properties of the financial instrument, right? That's like kind of like the first thing. And then the second thing is like, I like the differentiated takes. Like, if somebody's saying that you can't aggregate prediction markets, like my interests are piqued. So like, I would love for people to kind of like take counter positions and like argue for like why it may not be super common right now, but how it could be. Like, what is the way to make it possible? Like, if there's a bootstrapping problem, how to get over it. Alana, anything I'm missing?
Yeah, I would say like a helpful place to start would just be to define what do you mean by aggregation?
Yep. Okay. Thank you. So there's a lot of different things that we could say with aggregation. Like sometimes people refer to aggregating demand, and Jack and I wrote a piece called Fractal Protocols. And in that context, it means really about like how do you scoop up demand rather than what I'm really referring to in this topic, which is like aggregation as a service, like, you know, a 1inch or a kayak in the Web 2 context.
Like optimizing cross venue or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's also different degrees here, as Lon and I have kind of been figuring out. There's like a UX question of like just having a wrapper that makes it so that you're interfacing with different venues. Then there's like a much more like deep like optimization question of like aggregating liquidity across venues. That part is I'm open to discussing that part. So does that make sense?
Yeah, there's one thing that comes to my mind when you say you were talking about aggregation on the trading side on DEXs. I think there's one particular thing that is very different from like when you trade or when you use a lending protocol or like you say like prediction market. There's one thing that is just an atomic action and another thing that is like that lasts over time. And I think it's like two security profiles, very different, because on one side, you just do your trade and then you're done. So you don't take risk from a security perspective. Either the trade is performed and maybe you can have like on the aggregation side, just like check that I indeed receive what I was expecting. And if I'm not receiving that token back, then I just revert. And that logic is quite simple to integrate. So of course it's complicated to do all the computation and all the routes, etc. And this is where maybe the moat of an aggregator reside. That part is quite safe. While if you integrate many lending protocols, okay, you can maybe get the best rates, but is it the same risk? Will you have the same rates, the same best rate over time? And maybe you need to reallocate, but when do you reallocate, etc. And that complexify a lot of the things and also increase the security, the attack surface, I would say. So I think that's the first thing that come to my mind. Yes, sorry, I don't know.
I think that's an excellent point. And it's one of the things Dan and I were thinking a little bit about the way we've been describing it, but I like your framing a lot better is we've been describing it as like continuous versus discrete, where discrete is really what you're saying with atomic, and I think atomic is a better word for it. And you get like spot aggregation and then order execution, whereas Morpho was very much on sort of the continuous end of the spectrum. And one thing I'd love your guys' takes on is like, what are the other things on the continuous end of the spectrum? So we were thinking maybe perps exchanges fall a little bit more towards that end of the spectrum, and you start to see things closer to like risk managers, Merlin, to your point, that have to come in. And so there's a lot more layers and complexity to the aggregation. You start to get things that look a little bit more like a prime broker broker than just like an order executor.
Merlin, I'd love to follow with that, but I also know Michael specifically, this continuous versus discrete framing. I know Michael specifically with Legend, as an aggregator for lending. I know you've discussed with me personally the complexity of that problem, what Merlin was talking about, different risk, different rates, managing it all at once. I'd be curious if you wanted to add any more thoughts.
Yeah, it's definitely like from the beginning, we've basically taken the model of aggregation at a UX level and like across 7 different chains at this point, and basically creating this kind of meta chain for the user so that they can see a collection of opportunities and then they express their intent. I want to supply to this morpho market on World Chain, and they might have their positions on Optimism and Base, and the software basically figures out how do I route this user's asset to World Chain. And it is an interesting problem because, as Merlin is saying, it's not this ephemeral thing. The user's going to likely be supplying their assets over time. And then in that context, we're dealing with potentially more than one chain. So it isn't atomic. Like you have to figure out how to potentially withdraw their assets from another morpho market, a compound market, an Aave market on a different chain, bridge those assets, and then supply them onto like the lending market that they care to be supplying to. And yeah, it's an interesting experience because you have these edge cases, like you no longer have atomicity, like Merlin is saying. So you have to deal with the UX pains of, okay, maybe the bridge didn't go through. Like last week, for example, Base was crazy congested and some of the transactions didn't get picked up by the mempool. All right, so like how do you actually convey to the user that part of this transaction failed? Like you have to redo it. So there's definitely a lot of UX pain points of aggregation across chains. And basically what's taken us so long of just like ironing out to make this the best experience for the user, because like, hey, in DeFi, we're used to this type of stuff. But if you're going for people who are like used to a UX experience from a Coinbase or a Robinhood, like it's not okay for them. So like trying to iron that out is actually very difficult cross chain.
So we have lending, and just to pick up on Alana's point, I would love if we kind of like develop a spectrum, right? Because if everyone feels confident, super atomic on swaps, right? Lending is, I'm learning, right? Obviously much more difficult. There's more variables. It's continuous, not discrete, or atomic as we've been using, right? Where does perps fall into this? What are its unique challenges? How does it compare to like lending, for example, like if you had to stack rank them in their ease?
I guess the perps thing in particular, and Alana, you sort of alluded to this, but I think perps aggregation is almost more analogous to aggregating borrows as opposed to aggregating spot, which might be somewhat unintuitive at a start given the usual proximity between spot and perp. But it has to do with that ongoing management required. And I think that's where the risk pieces come in, where you see, I mean, on the perp side, you have funding rate params, OI caps, margin requirements, Oracle settings. On the borrow side, you have very similar supply borrow caps, max LTVs, Oracle settings. So it becomes very analogous. And then that gets to a place where just doing the atomic openness position doesn't work exactly quite as well as a spot swap or potentially even a single lend position. So I have 500 USDC, find me the best place to earn yield in it today, and I'm fine if it's not the best place in 2 weeks, so long as in average it's a pretty good spot. I think there's some difference there. And I guess on the perps or potentially the bar aggregation side, this is sort of a role that maybe the OTC desks have filled, the prime brokers have filled, that hasn't been productized quite like a swap aggregator quite yet. Maybe that's open opportunity. I know we've been thinking about it, but it's not easy given that, yeah, it's like you open a position, I want to find the best place to borrow 500 USDC. All the factors that come into that with liquidity across different chains, different collateral assets that are accepted, different collateral parameters that are accepted, all the different risk at hand. So yeah, it's a lot of different pieces that go into the perps aggregation side tied in with the bar aggregation side. So I'd add that on.
Here's my core question, right? Like in this framing, like, okay, it's a bad user experience basically to have them constantly come back. There's a lot to manage and it's ongoing, right? But that's just like a bad user experience, right? Like that just seems like that's a UX problem with perps generally. Like I'm going to take a theory here. I'm curious if I'm right. Like the theory seems to be like users constantly having to upkeep and management isn't great. Now, but how does aggregation across multiple different venues make it worse? And my guess is, I think what we're landing on is like, it's always a bad experience, like just like having to constantly go back to an interface and manage a position. But when you're adding multiple different venues, now the complexity is really massively increasing because you just have so much dynamism with so many different variables that like you're basically having to even be more attuned to it. It's like the UX experience is on hyperdrive because you have to be more involved with that interface because it's not just one. Yes, Merlin, please correct anything I said.
I think you Totally right. I think a good example is the number of dimensions that you can explore. On a DEX, you have the price. A lending protocol, you have also the risk aspect. So, okay, maybe you have a given yield, but against what are you exposed to? And this is not reflected maybe well in the yield. It should be, but in some lending venues, it's not. So how do you take that into account? Maybe you need another dimension to express that to the user. And so you increase a lot the complexity. And this is, for instance, something that on the Morpho interface, we want to stay neutral. So we like show all the different vols, which have like maybe different profiles. We show all the different markets. But from a user perspective, it's worse than having just like one USDC thing where you just know that you need to deposit there and that's it. It's one thing. And we have product like user feedback around that. But because we are providing that infrastructure, we want to stay neutral. We keep like displaying everything. And so it's a choice to be credibly neutral, but it goes against that UX that we're talking about. So yeah, I agree with what you say.
Yeah, I think to do proper aggregation, you need to have the right abstractions. And by that I mean is like, are you bundling the things together correctly? It's much easier to do with swaps because the interface for swaps is pretty consistent across all these protocols. Like at Legend, we've done a really hard job to like make sure that the lending partners that we interact with, like we convey which protocols you're going to be supplying to, but the interface is identical. Like the experience should be identical. And it's more of a curation piece of like, how do I make it so that these perps seem the same? Like for us, we want to ensure that the risk profiles are similar so that like similar risk profiles are bundled together. And like you should be choosing based on just like potentially interest rates or potentially historical interest rates or something like that. Or like, what are my collateral requirements or things like that. But it really is like, have you bundled the right group together to aggregate them to make them feel?
I think the risk point is so crucial, and I was saying earlier maybe the continuous versus discrete is an UX problem. But another thing is like if risk is a key variable that causes fragmentation or non-fungibility, right? Like the beautiful thing about a swap is that, as we've been saying over and over, it's atomic. A certain AMA may have a risk profile, but like I'm in and I'm out, right? Like I don't have much exposure to that risk profile once I'm in and out, just as a swapper. A lending protocol, of course, is different, right? You're in that, and that risk carries with you, and that's why it adds this dimension that you need to live with. Charlie, anything to add there?
I guess one of the pieces I'd say on the UX problem side is like, yes, it could be a UX problem, but it's also like, in my opinion, like that is the entire point of aggregating is a UX problem. So you don't like otherwise I would just go check all these venues manually. If I had to come back and check my aggregator position manually, that's the whole point. So if you can't solve the UX problem, like, are you really solving anything at all? And yeah, I guess like that it's the same piece. So yeah.
Elijah, please.
Yeah, this one's a little less sexy, but like I think for perps, it's just because like largely because, or maybe not largely, but like in part because there's like only really one big perp dex on each chain, and like it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem in the sense that like maybe there can only be like one dominant or like perp dex on a chain because there's no aggregation. Like aggregation like levels the playing field, but like perp dexes are really like the only app chains that have really done well because of like the synthetic nature of the liquidity. And then like, you kind of have GMX on Arbitrum, you have Hyperliquid on its own chain, you have like Aster on BNB. And so, yeah, like aggregating things cross chain is just way harder than like aggregating something on the same chain. So
Why specifically?
just like asynchrony, right? Like you kind of need to like bridge and like people charge fees for bridging. And yeah, it's a pain in the ass.
Nick, please.
Yeah, I think everyone's kind of circling the same point, which is aggregation is fairly simple and solved when you actually have a fungible asset that is being aggregated. But as you add more unique characteristics to the assets to what you're aggregating, it becomes more difficult to aggregate it. So like in the case of lending where you're increasing the risk, or you have different risk profiles for different pools that you could be putting it into, or cross chain where you are technically trading the same asset, but it has a separate bridging fee or a separate potential price impact when you're bridging. That is like makes it less of a fungible asset than just aggregating all these dexes across a single chain. And the same thing is true on a prediction market where you could technically have an aggregation of platforms for the same event. But if the underlying rules are separate and handle edge cases for resolution in a different way, then you're technically not having a fungible asset being aggregated. So like in 99% of cases, it works just fine because you're not going to reach the edge cases. But in the 1% that they do, you're going to be misrepresenting the opportunity to do an arbitrage between platforms that doesn't actually exist based off of the rules that are presented. So it's a bit of an issue of, how, I guess, from a UX perspective, how you present the separate vectors of risk for the lack of fungibility of the assets that you're trading.
I guess the follow-up for Nick, for you, and as a prediction market expert, is like, when is it acceptable for the aggregator to basically abstract away, as Michael was saying earlier, these very small points of fungibility? One example Alana and I were debating, just to give you an example, is sports, right? Like, you can imagine, one prediction market platform has the Yankee game, and another prediction market has the exact same Yankee game, but maybe they have a different oracle or a different resolver, right? Maybe one uses UMA and one uses zkTLS, whatever. Like, those are really similar, right? But they do have some very distinct and small differences. So like, I would argue that's an acceptable instance of when you can probably use aggregation. You have to live with the edge cases, but
well,
curious.
let me just jump in with an example of an edge case as it relates to sports, which is, say you're watching a college football game, and on one prediction market, you are betting like, will Clemson beat Syracuse? And you're betting like, yes. And then it turns out that Clemson and Syracuse tie. And so one prediction market resolves it as like, no, Clemson did not beat Syracuse. And the other prediction market just refunds everything. So it's technically like they both recognize the same outcome, but they resolve the markets different ways. Would be an example of sort of what Dan was saying.
Yeah, it's all baked into the rules. I mean, like, your oracle is hardly the problem. It's how you handle the data that is coming from the oracle, right? Because the score is going to be widely available. So that's a good example of a market that should be fine to be aggregated. The difficulty is what happens if like a tornado occurs and then the game gets moved to next week. Like, one platform is going to say, oh, neither team won, so both lost, or contract settled to 50 cents, or your position rolls over to when that game actually occurs. And that's where you have like the dissonance of what your position actually represents. And so I think, you have to have a general awareness of it as a user, right? You just have to know what those edge cases are. But it is a difficult problem because there is a benefit to having all these platforms aggregated to some degree. Obviously, right now there's two, but as there get more, it would be more beneficial. But at the same time, not making false promises off of like, oh, this is a free arbitrage because, this is 10 cents higher than this is, but based off of what the actual resolution criteria are, that's a fair value for the risk that you're taking.
Well put. Ludwig, I saw you want to chime in. I want to make sure, Ken.
Yeah, no, the conversation kind of moved along there, but wanted to push back against the idea that like aggregation is mostly, important with respect to UX. I think what we saw with swapping is that aggregation in the DEX spot market was mostly important because it solved, like, you can't do like the convex optimization problem in your head to optimally route liquidity, right? Whereas, having multiple tabs open to look at the underlying, the different perp markets, or, opening more Fonave and seeing where I'm getting better rates is not that complicated of an action to do. And so my point is rather that because DEX liquidity generally has been quite fragmented, because there hasn't been, a significant dominant force that has been able to make, LPs sustainably profitable, although that's a separate question altogether, we've seen a, significant fragmentation. And with respect to that, aggregation has been essential, right? Whereas, with perps, professional traders that are moving with very significant size, they'll use, something like in silico, like the trading terminal, and they will be able to see all these markets very easily in one view, and they can navigate them. And from a UX standpoint, I'd argue it's probably better than an aggregator because they just have the ultimate flexibility. So yeah, I think from that standpoint, it's also understanding like where it is most useful to the user as opposed to just purely the technical challenges. Because I think overall, if it unlocked that much and there was a clear, huge business case to building this, people would have built it.
That's a great point. I think it piggybacks on what Elijah was saying a little bit earlier, but like, yeah, just spit it back. It's not all markets really this dire need. Ultimately, the beautiful thing about aggregation is it has some sort of product market fit because it's inherently useful to aggregate information. But the utility obviously changes. Like with AMMs, there's an obvious explosion and long tail of different options. And like with prediction markets, right now we have two. Like the utility that you're getting out of aggregating obviously varies depending on the ability of it to basically have a long tail, it seems. Okay, as we're wrapping up here, I would love if somebody could basically like, we've unpacked the difficulties of aggregating and then some of the variables, but I would love if like somebody could take a position on like, okay, like assume it is useful to Ludwig's just point. What is the best way for these less obvious ones, like a prediction market or perps with these challenges to go about and actually build a successful aggregation as a service? Because you have to think, like Nick was saying earlier, like for prediction markets right now, maybe there's only two, but you have to think that there's going to be many, many different options over time. So like, how would you do it? You guys are all extremely high quality founders. How would you do it?
Can I like half answer your question?
Yes.
So I think that the actual answer to that is like it'll be done in the way that it's currently being done, which is that sophisticated parties like market makers will arbitrage across venue and will decide, how they want to take on that like multi-dimensional risk that like Merlin was kind of talking about, and they will underwrite that themselves. And so you could see that with like a basis trader on two perp platforms, where like them conducting that arbitrage brings those two platforms closer to equilibrium. And so my answer is that like sophisticated people in the free market will figure out these arbitrages and will dedicate businesses to them. But like it may not necessarily be productized in a commercial way where you have like a simple UI like a 1-inch. And that's probably like my directional answer to where I see this trend going.
I would play devil's advocate a little bit and say that like I think that's probably true where you will have sort of prices stabilize across the different markets, but it doesn't undermine the benefit of an aggregator for like splitting an order across multiple venues in order to like not move the market significantly if like a whale is coming in to benefit. So I think you're right that like the market makers will come in and again sort of stabilize the prices between the venues such that an aggregator presents less of an opportunity to arbitrage, but you may still have other reasons that an aggregator is useful.
So the reason why I would side with Jack here is because like I think that when you're dealing with like asynchronous environments, the most sophisticated players are going to be best positioned to like beat you to the chase. So if there is like a price dislocation, you could like benefit from getting routed to one place or another. I think by the time that like this like aggregator is like moving funds from one place to another and like doing some crazy solver thing or whatever, like there should be a market maker that already like eats up a lot of that gain that you would have gotten as like a user. Whereas like, I mean, this even happens on like DEX aggregation, right? Like I think DEX aggregation for a really long time was like pretty silly in the sense that like if you have a lot of people like sending routes at the same time, like the aggregator would return the same exact route for a bunch of these same users. But like between the time that like these transactions are actually submitted and they get landed, that price could change because all the aggregators are sending them to the same route. So they're almost like crowding that route. Yeah, like dynamic, like you could do this dynamically, like you could just check the price atomically, like on chain and stuff. And I think people are starting to do this now. But that problem will be like even more exacerbated when you have to like move it across chains or like between Kalshi and Polymarket or between like Aster and Hyperliquid, and those market makers will just be like a lot better at beating you to the chase. Then you might get a worse price.
I agree on the sophisticated side. Like obviously, if you're institutional actor, you're gonna already have the infrastructure set up to trade on all these venues separately. And why would you just get some BIP scraped off the top of your order to go to an aggregator when you could just check your APIs instantly and transact on the platform directly? But I do see there being a benefit of UX to just the generic user who doesn't really want to have to think about their order execution, but does enjoy like an aggregated liquidity because it can give them better execution across platforms. So I do see that as like a use case for aggregation generally, more so on the like retail side and the institutional side, particularly in prediction markets. I think like it's going to be simple enough to integrate directly onto each platform initially. But if a user wants to take the flyer on, an institution is going to be more aware of these underlying rule differences and the contract impact it has on the contracts underlying. But if the user wants to just like make a quick cent by arbing the odds between Polymarket and Kalshi and, just moving it very quickly, then I think that's a user base that would be interested in it, albeit not expanding to into the full realm of like all sophisticated players.
I don't think this is what you're looking for in the question, but like for like prediction markets, my favorite type of aggregation that's going on is like more about like the residual information that like people can kind of get from it. Like I follow this guy, I don't know if you guys know like 0x perp, but like I know him from like the AMM days, like when he was like deep into like on-chain derivatives and like AMMs and stuff like that. But he's been like a prediction market degen like over like the last few years, and he has like this blog where they have all these like prediction market APIs, and they like write kind of like articles based on like, you know, translating all of the different like probabilities into like actionable insights on the market. I kind of like that. I mean, it's not really like generalizable to like perps or like DEX markets or something like that, but it's like a form of aggregation.
Okay, then we can wrap it here. I know we're over anyway. That was really fun, guys. Thank you so much. I loved how just cobbled this together and just putting a lot more people in the room. It's usually a recipe for success. So if you guys are interested in this, we're going to be doing more of these types of things, and we'd love to keep having you guys. I think I like that it's like literally no work. Just show up and yap. Okay, so we'll get this video out. We'll get it edited. We'll send it to you. And thank you again.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Thank you,
Merlin.
sir.
Have a great day.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
one.
Thank you.